They took the farmhouse, they took the tractors, they took every dollar Ezra Sutter spent 60 years building. And they left a broke 21-year-old the trees everybody in Carroll County called dead. Roy Sutter laughed so hard at the will table, he had to put his coffee down. Congratulations, kid. You got the dead trees. Nobody in that office knew a highway ran under those trees. Nobody knew Ezra had spent 30 years making sure of it. Nobody knew that in 6 weeks, Roy would stand at a closing table, watching his own signature turn against him. A folder would land flat on the wood. The room would go so quiet you could hear the air conditioner. Caleb didn't say a word. He just started walking the rows. But before the folder, there was the will reading. And there was the laugh. The lawyer's office in Deacon's Mill smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet glue. The folder sat on the table between 4 people. They hadn't agreed on anything in 11 years. Roy Sutter sat closest to the window. His wife Denise sat beside him, scrolling something on her phone. A listing maybe, a moving truck maybe. Caleb sat across from them, same flannel he'd worn to the funeral 3 weeks earlier. It was the only thing clean. The farmhouse and the surrounding 40 acres, the lawyer said, sliding a page toward Roy. Go to Roy Sutter. Roy didn't even try to hide the smile. The equipment, the tractors, and the equity in the operating account, the lawyer went on. Also to Roy Sutter. Per the will's specific bequest. Denise exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since March. And the 10-acre orchard parcel on Sutter Ridge, the lawyer said, turning the last page around so Caleb could see it. To Caleb Sutter. That was when Roy laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A real one, from the chest, the kind of laugh a man gives when the joke is finally, mercifully over. Congratulations, kid, he said, wiping one eye. You got the dead trees. Caleb looked at the page. 10 acres, Sutter Ridge. Legal language flattening 18 years of memory into one paragraph. He had $83 in his checking account. He knew that number the way you know your own pulse. He checked it every morning like a man checking a wound. 18 years without fruit, Roy said, leaning back. Enjoying himself now. No road frontage. County's got it valued at, what, 4,000? 5. You could burn it for firewood and come out ahead. Roy, the lawyer said, I'm just saying what everybody's thinking. Roy looked at Caleb. Ezra loved you, I'm sure. But love don't pay property tax. Denise didn't look up from her phone. We already talked to a realtor about the farmhouse, she said, to nobody in particular, about what it'll fetch once we clear the equipment out. Roy's got his eye on a place near Myrtle Beach. Caleb folded the deed once. He put it in his jacket pocket. He didn't argue. Arguing with Roy was like arguing with weather. You just waited it out. You walked home wet. He walked home wet that day too. It had nothing to do with rain. The cider shed on Sutter Ridge had been his grandfather's. Before that, his great-grandfather's. It still smelled the way it always had. Apples gone to vinegar in the wood. Kerosene. Dust that had settled so many times it had its own weather system. Caleb had been sleeping there since the funeral, on a cot dragged in from the barn. The farmhouse belonged to Roy now. Roy had made it clear, without saying it out loud, that Caleb's welcome had an expiration date. He sat on the cot that first night, deed still folded in his pocket. He looked out through a gap in the boards at 10 acres of orchard rows gone half wild, branches like arthritic fingers against a purple sky. Somewhere out there, buried, was something Ezra had never told him the shape of. Only that it existed. Count the rows before you count the money, Ezra used to say. The summer before he died, standing right where Caleb was sitting now, coffee cup steaming in the cold morning. You'll understand someday. I didn't leave you trees, Caleb. I left you the road nobody remembers is under them. Caleb hadn't understood it then. He didn't understand it now. But he'd carried the sentence around for 2 years. Like a stone in your pocket, worn smooth from touching it too many times. Never quite sure why you keep it. He was $83 from broke. Roy had a moving truck already scheduled, and somewhere under 10 acres of dead apple trees was an answer he didn't know how to ask for yet. The next morning, he did what he always did, got up before the sun, filled his grandfather's dented water jug at the shed's outdoor spigot, walked the rows. It wasn't hope exactly. Closer to muscle memory. Ezra had walked these rows every morning of Caleb's life, pruning shears in one hand, water jug in the other, talking to the trees like they were slow but well-meaning neighbours, Caleb had walked beside him since he was 7. He kept walking now because stopping felt like the last betrayal. The one thing Roy hadn't managed to take. Most of the trees really were dead. 18 years of neglect did that. Black branches, bark peeling like old paint, roots choked by scrub brush nobody had cleared. But there was one tree, near the back fence line, that still put out fruit every October. Small and sour, and utterly, defiantly alive. Caleb always stopped there. He pruned the deadwood off it with the same shears Ezra had used, oiled the hinge with the same rag, told it, out loud, that it was doing fine. "You're the only one still trying," he said that morning, thumb running over a knot in the bark. "Rest of us gave up a while back." He didn't mean himself. Not really. He meant the family, the farm, the whole slow unravelling that started long before Ezra got sick. Denise's Buick pulled up the gravel drive around 10 that morning, dust rolling behind it like a warning. She got out in heels not built for a dirt road, picked her way toward the cider shed with a clipboard under one arm. "Roy wants an inventory," she said, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. "Anything in here that's not nailed down, we need it catalogued before the estate sale." "It's my land, Denise. It's your trees," she corrected, already walking the perimeter of the shed, tapping the clipboard against her thigh. "The shed's on the 40 acres. That's Roy's." Caleb thought about the line on the county map. Nobody had bothered to explain it clearly at the reading. For the first time, he understood that even the roof over his cot might not technically be his. He said nothing. He'd learned that too. "There's an ammunition box in the corner," Denise said, peering through the doorway. "Old military surplus thing. That's probably worth something to a collector. It's got Ezra's tools in it." "Then it's part of the equipment bequest," she said, writing something down. "We'll come get it Thursday." Caleb watched her go. Watched the Buick pull a slow, careful 3-point turn to avoid scratching the paint on a fence post. Something tightened in his chest that wasn't quite anger, closer to watching water go down a drain you can't plug. He thought about the ammunition box. He'd seen it 100 times, shoved under a floorboard in the back corner, half hidden under burlap sacks. He'd never opened it. It had always felt like Ezra's, the way a man's toolbox feels like his hands. Off limits by nature, not by rule. He waited until Denise's dust settled on the road. Then he went back inside. The floorboard in the back corner had always squeaked a particular way, a 2-note complaint Caleb could have picked out of a lineup of squeaks. He knelt down, ran his fingers along the seam, felt something he'd never noticed in 18 years of walking past it. The board wasn't just loose. It was cut. Someone had taken a saw to it once, cleanly, and refit it so the cut barely showed. Not unless you were kneeling exactly where Caleb was kneeling. Not unless you had 3 days before your uncle's wife came to catalogue it. He worked his fingers into the seam. He pulled. The board came up easier than it should have, like it had been lifted before, more than once by hands that knew the trick. Underneath, wedged into the joist space, sat the ammunition box Denise had already claimed for Roy's inventory. Heavier than it looked, locked, and taped to the underside of the lid, where a careless inventory would never think to check, was a small brass key. Caleb sat back on his heels. He looked at it a long moment before he touched it. "Count the rows before you count the money," he said out loud. To the empty shed. To nobody. To Ezra, maybe, wherever Ezra was. It didn't sound like a riddle anymore. It sounded like an instruction. One he was only now old enough, or desperate enough, to follow. He didn't open the box that day. He put the floorboard back exactly the way he'd found it, brushed the dust into the seam so it looked untouched, walked back out to the rows to finish what he'd started with the one living tree. Some habits you keep even when the whole world is falling in around you, maybe especially then. 3 days later, a man he'd never seen before parked a state truck on the shoulder of Route 58. He stood at the fence line almost 20 minutes, or a clipboard of his own tucked under one arm. He took photographs of the ridge, the dead rows, the exact stretch of ground where Caleb's cider shed sat, catching morning light like it had a reason to. Caleb watched him from the shed doorway. He didn't go out to ask what he wanted. Not yet. Something in him said wait. Something in him had started saying that a lot lately, ever since the floorboard came up easier than it should have. He had a locked box now, a saw-cut floorboard, a brass key with no visible use yet, and a sentence from a dead man that suddenly felt less like grief and more like a map somebody had drawn on purpose, for exactly this morning, for exactly him. He waited for dark. Not superstition exactly. Denise had a habit of driving past the ridge on her way home from the grocery store, slowing down just enough to look. Caleb didn't want her headlights catching him kneeling over an open floorboard, not with a stranger's state truck still fresh in his memory. Some things you keep for yourself a little longer. Even from family, especially from family. He lit the kerosene lantern Ezra had kept hanging by the shed door for 40 years, worked the floorboard free, lifted the ammunition box out into the light, heavier than an empty box had any right to be. Green paint chipped down to bare metal at the corners, a padlock the size of his thumb, rusted orange but intact. He fit the small brass key into it, felt the mechanism give with a click, too loud for the empty shed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, was a folded map. Underneath it, a stack of papers bound with a rubber band that crumbled the second he touched it. He unrolled the map first, a county survey plat, hand-drafted in careful draftsman's ink, the kind of document that predated computers, predated even Caleb's father, dated 1969. It showed Sutter Ridge in the careful cross-hatching surveyor's use for elevation. Running straight through the middle, through what was now the Dead Orchard Rose, was a corridor marked in red ink, 40 feet wide, labelled in block letters. Proposed Route 58 bypass, ROW right-of-way. Caleb didn't know exactly what that meant, not with any precision. But he knew what a highway looked like on a map, and he knew this ridge had one running through it that nobody currently alive, as far as he understood, had ever mentioned. Underneath the map, the papers were a deed, or something close to one, filed with the Carroll County Recorder's Office, stamped in ink gone the colour of weak tea, dated the same year as the map. It named a corridor. It named an easement. And at the very bottom, in a signature Caleb recognised from 21 years of birthday cards, it named Ezra Sutter. He sat on the dirt floor with a lantern guttering beside him. He read it twice, then a third time. His brain kept refusing to hold on to what his eyes were telling it. His grandfather hadn't inherited this ridge. The deed made that plain. Ezra had bought it. In 1969, $11 an acre. At a time nobody wanted a ridge with no road frontage and thin, rocky soil. At a time, apparently, when Ezra Sutter knew something about that ridge, the rest of Carroll County did not. Count the rows before you count the money, Caleb said again. This time it landed different. Less like a riddle, more like a man handing his grandson a loaded gun and trusting him to grow into the aim. He didn't sleep that night. He sat with the map spread across his knees, tracing the red corridor with one finger. From the county road up through the ridge, through rows he'd walked 10,000 times without once knowing what slept beneath them. By morning he had a name in his head. Gordon Pruitt. Ezra used to mention him the way you mention an old friend you don't see enough. A fishing buddy. A man who'd worked the county surveyor's office 30 years before, retiring to a place off Fancy Gap Road with too many dogs and not enough visitors. Caleb found the house by memory more than direction. A low brick rancher with a wraparound porch, 3 dogs that announced him a quarter-mile out. Gordon Pruitt came to the door in suspenders and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, squinting at Caleb like he was trying to place a half-remembered face. "You're Ezra's boy," he said finally. Not a question. Grandson. "Caleb, come in, come in." "Watch the dog. He bites if you look nervous." Gordon waved him toward a kitchen table covered in seed catalogues and a half-finished crossword. "What's Ezra's grandson doing on my porch at 7 in the morning looking like he hasn't slept?" Caleb unrolled the map between them, careful of the coffee ring already there. Gordon went quiet in a way that made the room feel smaller. He put his glasses down properly this time, leaned in, traced the red corridor with one finger, exactly the way Caleb had the night before. Like the gesture was hereditary too. "Well, I'll be damned," he said soft, talking to the map more than to Caleb. "I ran this line myself. 1969, maybe 70. Me and a 2-man crew. Out here 3 weeks in August heat that'd kill a man twice my age now." He looked up. "This is the old bypass corridor. State wanted to run 58 straight through here. Cut the curve out down by the river. Save truckers maybe 4 minutes." He laughed short and dry. 4 minutes. That's what this was for. They never built it. No, money dried up. Some senator's cousin owned land on the other proposed route. Politics did what politics does. State shelved it. Most folks forgot it was ever drawn. Gordon tapped the deed. But shelved ain't the same as dead. A recorded right-of-way corridor don't expire just because nobody built on it yet. It sits there, legally binding, waiting. My uncle thinks the orchard's worth about $4,000. Gordon looked at him over the reading glasses. Your uncle's math is real interesting when it comes to real estate. He's got a contract on a place in Myrtle Beach, contingent on selling the farmhouse and equipment. He know about this? No. Caleb folded the map's corner gently, like it might tear if he was rough with it. Nobody does. Except you now. Gordon studied him a long moment, the kind of look a man gives when he's deciding how much weight a young pair of shoulders can carry. Your grandfather bought this ridge for $11 an acre. In 1970, he said. Everybody in the county thought he'd lost his mind. Rocky soil. No frontage. Half the trees already sick. But Ezra Sutter had been on that survey crew with me for 2 of those 3 weeks. Hauling chain. Driving stakes. He knew exactly what ran under that dirt before he ever signed a check for it. Why didn't he just tell people? Sell it to the state himself back then? Because the state wasn't ready to build. And Ezra wasn't a man in a hurry. Gordon shook his head slowly. He used to say patience was the only kind of money poor men could actually save up. He planted an orchard on top of a highway corridor, waited 30, 40 years for the world to catch back up to him. That's not luck, son. That's a man playing the longest game I ever personally witnessed. Caleb thought about the water jug, every Sunday morning of his life, pruning a tree that gave sour, stubborn fruit nobody wanted to eat, because his grandfather told him to. He'd never once asked why. There's a state truck been parked on the shoulder, he said. Man taking pictures of the ridge. Gordon's face sharpened into something more careful. That means the bypass is back on somebody's list. VDOT's been talking about relieving 58 traffic through here for 2 years now, since the plant opened up in Hillsville. If they're out here surveying, they're getting ready to move on this corridor for real. He tapped the deed again, and whoever holds clear title to that right-of-way is about to be the only person at that table with any actual leverage. That's me. That's you, Gordon said, if the chain of title holds up. Ezra to you. Clean. Through the will. No liens. No other claimants. He looked hard at Caleb. Your uncle didn't inherit the orchard, did he? No, he inherited the farmhouse. I got the trees. Gordon smiled for the first time since Caleb unrolled the map. Slow. Satisfied. Then your uncle laughed his way out of the only asset on that whole estate that was actually worth something. He stood, went to a filing cabinet in the corner older than Caleb, pulled out a battered accordion folder. I kept my own copies of every survey I ever ran in this county. Habit from working for the state. They lose paperwork like it's a competitive sport. Let's find the corroborating file. Make sure your grandfather's deed holds up when somebody official comes looking. They spread 3 documents across the kitchen table. The original 1969 plat. Gordon's field notes in handwriting gone spidery with age. The recorded deed from the ammunition box. They matched them line for line. Corner marker to corner marker. Caleb had never read a survey document in his life. Even he could see it. 3 different angles. The exact same story. It's real, Gordon said finally. It's recorded. It's clean. And Caleb, he added, looking up, it is worth a great deal more than dead trees. Caleb rolled the map back up. His hands weren't quite steady. For the first time in 3 weeks, $83 didn't feel like the only number that mattered anymore. He still didn't know how much the corridor was worth. He still didn't know how to tell Roy, or whether to tell Roy at all. What was a man supposed to do with news this size? After a lifetime of being the punchline instead of the one holding the folder. But he knew something. Driving back to the ridge. The map rode on the seat beside him like a passenger. The water jug. The Sunday mornings. The one stubborn tree. None of it had ever once been about hope. They had been about waiting for exactly this morning. He didn't tell Roy that week. He didn't tell anyone but Gordon. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense to a man raised watching his grandfather move slow and careful through every decision that mattered. He got a copy of the recorded deed certified at the county clerk's office. $41 out of his 83. He tucked it in a manila envelope that lived from then on under the cot in the cider shed, close enough to reach in the dark. Thursday came, and with it Denise's truck, and two men Caleb didn't recognize loading Ezra's tools into the truck bed while she checked items off her clipboard. She barely glanced at the ammunition box's empty resting spot under the floorboard. Caleb had put it back exactly where it belonged, minus its contents. Nailed the board down snug enough that nobody would think to pry it again. "Roy wants the shed cleared by the 15th, Denise said, not quite looking at him. "You'll need to find somewhere else." "I know. There's a room over the Faraday place, I heard. Cheap." She almost sounded like she meant it kindly. "Almost. This isn't personal, Caleb. It's my grandfather's land," he said. "It's about as personal as it gets." She didn't have an answer for that. She finished her clipboard and left. Caleb stood in the empty cider shed, listening to the truck engine fade down the ridge road, one hand resting on the manila envelope in his jacket. He understood that whatever came next, he needed more than a certified deed and a retired surveyor's word. He needed to know exactly what a highway corridor through Sutter Ridge was worth, and to whom, and how fast. The public library in Deacon's Mill had exactly one computer with working internet, not locked to the reference desk. Caleb spent 3 straight afternoons on it, feeding coins into the copier, reading everything he could find. VDOT right-of-way acquisitions, easement valuations, something called just compensation, a phrase that kept turning up in old newspaper clippings. Other counties, other highways, other families who woke up one morning owning something the state suddenly wanted. He learned that when a state needs a corridor, it doesn't ask nicely forever. It can condemn the land through eminent domain if the owner won't sell. But even then, the law requires the state to pay fair market value. And fair market value for a recorded right-of-way corridor, he learned, reading it 3 times to be sure, was not calculated the way Roy calculated the value of dead apple trees. It was calculated by the acre, by the frontage, by comparable sales, by how badly the state needed this exact stretch of ground. He didn't have $83 anymore. He had 62, after the certified copy. The copier coins. A tank of gas he couldn't avoid. He was still sleeping in a cider shed. He had 15 days left to vacate. But for the first time since the will reading, he felt like a man holding a hand of cards, not a man being dealt one. The librarian Patsy Dillard had known Ezra from the Methodist Church potluck circuit for 30 years. She started leaving him a thermos of coffee on the reference desk. Never said anything about it. The same way you'd leave water out for a stray dog you decided to keep an eye on. She never asked what he was researching. She just refilled the thermos and pointed him toward the microfiche machine when the online archive ran out. "Your grandfather used to sit right there," she told him once, nodding at the corner table, reading the paper cover to cover every Tuesday like it was scripture. "He never talked about the ridge," Caleb said. "Not really, just that one line he used to say." "Ezra Sutter didn't talk about anything he was still working on," Patsy said. "He talked about things after he'd already finished them. That was just his way." She slid a folder across the desk, newspaper clippings she'd pulled without being asked, county commission minutes from decades back, mentioning a shelved bypass project. I remembered these being filed somewhere, thought they might help. A small thing, a folder from a librarian who barely knew him. But Caleb sat with it a long time after she went back to shelving. Something loosened in his chest. It had been clenched since the will table. Denise's 15-day deadline arrived fast. Caleb moved his cot and 2 duffel bags into the room over the Faraday place. Cheap. The kind of cheap where the water heater worked half the time and the landlord didn't ask questions. $40 a week. It ate through what little he had left, almost as fast as he earned it doing fencing work for a neighbour named Wilkes. Cash pay. No complaints even when Caleb showed up smelling like a man who hadn't showered properly in 2 days. He kept the manila envelope with the certified deed under his pillow. He kept walking the rows every Sunday, water jug in hand. Even though the cider shed was locked now, he had to climb the back fence to reach the one living tree. It was on one of those Sunday walks, 3 weeks after the will reading, that he found the note, tucked into a knothole in the trunk of the living tree. A spot Caleb had passed his thumb over 1,000 times. A small waxed paper packet, brittle with age. Inside it, a folded scrap of paper. Handwriting Caleb would have known blind. The same hand that had signed birthday cards and the recorded deed both. If you're reading this, it read, "You found the box, and you found Gordon, and you're standing right where I used to stand every morning, wondering if I'd wasted my whole life on a hunch. I didn't. Neither will you. The road is real. The road is yours. Don't let Roy's laugh be louder in your head than my handwriting. Count the rows, Caleb. Then go count what they're worth." Caleb sat down in the dirt between the rows. He read it 4 times. For the first time since the funeral, he let himself cry. Not loud, not long, just the kind of crying a man does alone in an orchard, when the person who loved him best turns out to have loved him even more carefully than he ever let on. He didn't tell Gordon about the note, some things you keep, at least for a while, the way you keep a photograph nobody else needs to see to believe in it. The following Tuesday he drove to Wytheville, to the regional VDOT office. He asked, plainly, at the front counter, whether there was any active planning file. A Route 58 bypass corridor through Carroll County. The woman at the counter, a district right-of-way agent named Carol Meese, looked at him a long moment, asked him to wait, came back 20 minutes later with a folder and a much more careful expression. "There's a preliminary corridor study," she said, choosing her words carefully. "It's early. Nothing's been formally approved by the Commonwealth Transportation Board. But there's interest, given the traffic growth out of the Hillsville Industrial Park. Does the study include Sutter Ridge?" Her expression didn't change. That told Caleb almost as much as an answer would have. "I can't discuss specific parcels in an active study." "I own that ridge," Caleb said. "Free and clear. Recorded right-of-way deed from 1969. My grandfather's name on it." Carol Meese looked at him a long moment. Something in her face shifted, cautious to genuinely interested. "You have documentation? Certified copy?" "In my truck." "Bring it in," she said. "If that corridor's legitimate and it overlaps our study area, that changes how this conversation goes. Considerably." He brought the folder in. She photocopied it, made a phone call to someone she called only the district engineer, told Caleb, in the flat, careful voice of a government employee, that if the corridor held up under review, the state would need to acquire the right-of-way from him directly, per state code, whether he wanted to sell it or not. "How much is fair market value for something like this?" Caleb asked. "I can't give you a number today," she said, "but it won't be $4,000. She almost smiled. "Corridors like this, once confirmed, tend to get appraised in the hundreds of thousands, sometimes more, depending on frontage and comparable easement sales." Caleb drove back to Deacon's Mill with both hands tight on the wheel, not from fear exactly, more the strange vertigo of watching a number turn, in one conversation, from the dead rows into something with 6 figures attached to it. He didn't tell Roy, not yet. He told Gordon that night, on the porch, dogs settling around their feet. Gordon just nodded slowly. Like a man watching a fish he'd been patient about finally take the hook. "Your grandfather knew this day was coming," Gordon said. "He just didn't know exactly when. That's the whole art of it, Caleb. Knowing something's true long before anybody else agrees to believe you." Caleb thought about the note in his jacket pocket, the one he still hadn't shown anyone, the $11 an acre, the 30 years of Sunday mornings. Sitting on that porch, he understood the real inheritance had never been the ridge at all. It had been the patience to wait for it. Roy found out the way most secrets in a town like Deacon's Mill get found out. Somebody else talked first. Carol Meese's district engineer, a man named Whitfield, had no particular loyalty to keeping Caleb's business private. He mentioned the Sutter Ridge Corridor Review to the county's Economic Development Office. They mentioned it to a county supervisor at a Rotary lunch. He mentioned it almost in passing to Roy Sutter at the hardware store. Thought he was making friendly conversation. "Heard the state's looking hard at your nephew's orchard for the new bypass," the supervisor said, clapping Roy on the shoulder like he'd just told him he'd won a small prize. "Ought to be a nice little windfall for that boy." Roy didn't say much back. He paid for his fence staples. He drove straight to the room over the Faraday place. He was standing outside Caleb's door within the hour, red in the face, the way Caleb had only seen once before, at the funeral, when the pastor ran 20 minutes long and cut into Roy's plans for the afternoon. "You knew," Roy said, skipping the greeting. "You knew about this and you let me stand there at that table, hand you dead trees like I was doing you a favour." "I didn't know at the will reading," Caleb said, which was true. "I found the deed after." What deed? The one Ezra recorded in 1969. The right-of-way corridor. It's his land, Roy. He bought it fair, decades before either of us was born. It's mine now. Clean. Through the will. Roy's jaw worked like he was chewing something that wouldn't go down easy. That corridor runs under land. My daddy worked his whole life. It runs under the 10 acres the will gave to me, Caleb said. Quiet. The way Ezra used to get quiet right before saying something that mattered. Not the 40 you got. Just mine. We'll see about that. Roy's voice dropped into a register Caleb recognised. A lifetime of watching him negotiate feed prices. The sound of a man deciding to fight dirty because fighting fair wasn't working. I'm talking to a lawyer. Ezra wasn't in his right mind those last few years. Everybody knew it. If there's some old deed floating around that conveniently surfaces right when the state's writing checks, I think a judge is going to want a real close look at when that thing got recorded. And by who? And whether my nephew had any hand in forging it. It's dated 1969, Roy. I was born in 2004. Then maybe somebody helped you find it, Roy said, already turning to leave. Maybe somebody's been coaching you this whole time. We'll let the court sort out the timeline. I've got a moving contract in Myrtle Beach. I am not about to let some fairy tale about a highway cost me that house. He left without slamming the door. Somehow that felt worse. Caleb called Gordon that night, hands shaking a little as he dialed. Gordon listened without interrupting, the way a man listens when he's already decided what needs to happen next. He's going to challenge the deed, Caleb said. Say it's forged, or that Ezra wasn't competent when he recorded it. Ezra recorded that deed in 1969, Gordon said. I was standing next to him at the courthouse when he filed it. I can testify to that under oath if it comes to it. There's a clerk's stamp with a date that predates your existence by 35 years. That's about as hard a fact as a courtroom ever gets. A pause. Roy's scared Caleb. Scared men say wild things. Don't let it rattle you into doing something foolish. Like what? Like signing anything, Gordon said. The state's going to come at you with an offer eventually. Roy's lawyer is going to come at you with pressure. Somewhere in there, somebody's going to hand you a piece of paper, tell you it needs signing today, right now, before you think too hard about it. That's when men lose things they shouldn't. You wait. You let your lawyer read every word first. I don't have a lawyer. You do now, Gordon said. My daughter's boy, Nathaniel Cross, passed the bar 4 years back, practices out of independence. He owes me a favour. I'll call him tonight. Nathaniel Cross turned out younger than Caleb expected, maybe 30. Careful, unhurried manner. A man who'd learned early that rural clients trusted quiet more than flash. He read the deed, the plat, Gordon's field notes, and the note from the knothole twice through said nothing at first. This is about as clean as inherited title gets, Nathaniel said finally. Recorded, dated, witnessed by a surveyor still living, who can testify to first-hand knowledge of the original survey. Your uncle can file whatever challenge he wants, but he's going to need actual evidence of incompetency or fraud, not just suspicion. I don't see how he manufactures that against a deed older than his own marriage. He tapped the note. Keep this safe. Not legally binding on its own, but it's powerful context if this ever goes in front of a judge. Or, more likely, a mediator, which is usually where these things actually get settled. Roy's already got a contract on a house in Myrtle Beach, Caleb said. He's counting on selling the farmhouse and equipment to cover it. Then your uncle has a cash flow problem, Nathaniel said. That has nothing to do with your deed, and everything to do with spending money he didn't have yet. That's not a legal argument. That's just bad planning. The formal corridor study cleared preliminary review 6 weeks later, faster than Carol Meese had predicted, pushed along by the industrial park's growing truck traffic. A state senator wanting a ribbon cutting before the next election, she admitted on the phone. The Commonwealth Transportation Board approved the bypass alignment for further engineering. Nathaniel translated it plainly over coffee at Patsy's library table. The state was now formally, officially, going to need to acquire the right-of-way through Sutter Ridge. Whether Caleb wanted to sell it, or whether the state had to condemn it through eminent domain and pay him anyway. Either way, a number was coming. And numbers, Caleb had learned by now, had a way of turning family arguments into something closer to war. He spent that week doing the thing he'd always done when the world got loud. He went back to the Rose, pruned deadwood off trees that would never fruit again, just to keep his hands busy, refilled the water jug twice a day, out of habit more than need. Wilkes stopped by one afternoon with a truckload of fence posts he didn't strictly need help unloading, and the two of them worked in silence for an hour, the way men do when neither one wants to talk about the real thing yet. "You holding up?" Wilkes finally said. "Not really a question. Trying to." "Your grandfather held up the same way," Wilkes said, quiet and busy with his hands. Man never once let the noise in his head show up on his face. He tossed the last post onto the pile. "You're doing that, whether you know it or not." Caleb didn't have much to say back to that. He just kept working, the way Ezra always had, and let the compliment sit in his chest without needing to answer it out loud. That was when the second thing happened, the thing Gordon had warned him about, without quite predicting its shape. A man in a good suit showed up at the Faraday place. Not Roy's lawyer, someone new. A folder in hand, a friendly, professional smile that didn't match his eyes. He introduced himself as representing a private developer. Interested in the Sutter Ridge frontage, corridor rights included. Cash offer. Quick close. No waiting on the state's slower timeline. $45,000, the man said, sliding a one-page offer sheet across the porch railing. "As is. We handle all the closing costs. You could have cash in your account inside 2 weeks." $45,000 was more money than Caleb had ever seen written down with his own name attached to it. For one long, dizzy second, sitting there with $62 long since turned to almost nothing, he understood exactly how a person signs something they shouldn't. Then he thought of Carol Meese saying hundreds of thousands, sometimes more. He thought of Gordon's warning about paper handed to you today, right now. He thought of Ezra's handwriting in a knothole. "Don't let Roy's laugh be louder than your own patience." "I need my lawyer to look at this first," Caleb said, folding the offer sheet closed without reading past the number. The man's smile flickered, just slightly. "That's certainly your right, though offers like this don't always stay on the table long." "Then I guess it won't be on the table," Caleb said and handed it back. He called Nathaniel from the porch steps, the second the man's car cleared the driveway. Nathaniel, when he heard the number, laughed once. Short. Without much humour in it. 45,000, he said, for a right-of-way corridor the state's about to condemn for market value. "That's not a generous offer, Caleb. That's somebody trying to buy your future courthouse award for pennies, before you understand what it's worth." A pause. "Whoever that was, they know exactly what your ridge is worth. That's precisely why they showed up before the state's appraisal became public." Caleb sat on the porch steps a long time after that call, turning the number over in his head. 45,000 against hundreds of thousands, sometimes more. He understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that the whole world had suddenly decided his grandfather's dead orchard was worth fighting over. Everyone, it seemed, except the family who'd handed it to him as a joke. Roy filed his challenge to the deed 9 days later. A petition drawn up by a Galax attorney named Hollis Beecham. He specialised, as far as Caleb could tell, mostly in disputes between neighbours over fence lines and cattle. The petition alleged, in language stiffer than Roy would ever use to Caleb's face, that the 1969 deed's chain of custody was unclear. That Ezra Sutter's documented cognitive decline in his final years cast doubt on his estate planning. That the court should order a formal title examination first. Word of the petition reached Patsy Dillard within a day, the way most things did in that county, and she pulled Caleb aside at the library the next time he came in, voice low even though the reading room was empty. "I heard what your uncle filed," she said, "about Ezra's mind those last years." Her mouth tightened. "I sat with your grandfather every Tuesday for 6 years, Caleb, going over the paper together. That man's mind was sharper at 80 than most men's are at 50. If Roy's lawyer wants a witness to say different, he's going to have to find somebody who spent more time with Ezra than I did, and there wasn't anybody. Would you say that to a judge or a mediator?" "I'd say it to the governor if he asked," Patsy said, and the flatness in her voice told Caleb she meant every word of it. "Your grandfather was one of the finest minds this library ever had. Walk through its doors. And I won't sit quiet while somebody rewrites that just to make a real estate deal work out easier." Caleb thanked her and drove straight to Nathaniel's office. And by the end of the week, Patsy Dillard had joined Gordon Pruitt on a short, growing list of people willing to stand up in a room and say, under oath if it came to that, exactly who Ezra Sutter had really been. Nathaniel read the petition over his own kitchen table, Caleb across from him, and shook his head slowly. "This is thin," Nathaniel said. "The deed's dated 1969. Your grandfather's cognitive decline, if there was any, happened decades later. There's no legal theory here that connects the two, except hoping a judge won't look closely." He tapped the page. "But thin doesn't mean free. This is going to cost you time, possibly a filing fee or two, and it's absolutely going to slow the state's timeline until it's resolved." "How long?" "Months if we're lucky. A year if Beecham's trying to run out the clock." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "That developer's man show up again?" "Twice more. Upped the offer to 60,000 the last time." "That tells me something," Nathaniel said. "Somebody's in a hurry. And people in a hurry to buy something cheap usually know it's about to get expensive." Caleb stopped by Nathaniel's office again the following morning, before Wilkes's fence work started, just to sit a while and let the pace of the last few weeks settle, instead of pile up on top of him. Nathaniel's secretary, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth Ann, who'd worked there longer than Nathaniel had practiced law, poured him coffee without being asked, and told him gently that most people in this county eventually got the reckoning they'd earned, one way or another, even if it took longer than seemed fair. "You sound like Gordon," Caleb said. "Gordon and I went to the same church for 30 years, Ruth Ann said. "Some things rub off." She topped off his cup. "For what it's worth, half this town's already decided how they feel about your uncle laughing at those trees. You don't need a mediator to win that particular argument. You already have." Caleb thought about that walking back out to his truck, and it settled something in him he hadn't realised was still unsettled. A small, steady confirmation that whatever happened in that conference room, the county itself had already quietly cast its verdict. It was Gordon 3 days later, sitting on his porch with a dog's head heavy on his knee, who cracked the case open in a direction Caleb hadn't thought to look. "I've been thinking about something," Gordon said. "It's been sitting wrong in my gut since you first showed me that deed." He pulled a battered ledger from the same accordion folder, his own record book, kept since his working days, land transactions across 4 decades. He flipped to a page marked 1970, turned it around for Caleb to see. "Your grandfather didn't buy that ridge from a stranger, Caleb. He bought it from the county itself, at a tax auction, after the previous owner defaulted. I remember, because I was there, that there was another bidder that day, a land speculator out of Roanoke. He'd gotten wind, same as Ezra had, that the state was drawing up bypass plans. Someone else knew. Someone else suspected," Gordon corrected. "Ezra knew because he'd walked that survey line with his own boots. The Roanoke man was just guessing, working off rumour. When Ezra outbid him for $11 an acre, the fellow was hopping mad, made a real scene at the courthouse steps, said something Ezra apparently never forgot." Gordon closed the ledger. The speculator's name was Delbert Kane. Delbert Kane's grandson runs a development firm out of Roanoke to this day. Caleb felt something cold move through him. The man who's been showing up with offers. "I'd bet my truck on it," Gordon said. "Which means this was never really about buying dead trees cheap, son. It's a 50-year-old grudge circling back around. The Kane family's been waiting just as long as your grandfather was, hoping this exact corridor would come open again someday, so they could finally get what their granddaddy lost at that auction." Caleb sat with that a long moment, the porch boards creaking under the dog's shifting weight. He understood the strange clarity that kept arriving in pieces this whole ordeal, that Ezra hadn't just been patient about a highway. He'd been patient about a man too, or at least that man's family, certain that someday the fight would come back to this exact ridge, certain enough to leave a note in a knothole instead of a lawyer's letter. Paper in a tree lasts as long as the tree does. Ezra had planted that tree to outlive them both. "Does this help my case?" Caleb asked. "It helps you understand your case," Gordon said. "Whether it helps Nathaniel argue it in front of a judge, that's different. But knowing why a man's really fighting you is worth almost as much as knowing you're going to win." Caleb drove home that night, turning the name Delbert Kane over in his head, like a stone he hadn't decided yet whether to keep. 2 days later, going through a box of Ezra's old church bulletins and farm receipts, rescued by Patsy Dillard from the estate sale pile, he found the second piece, a single receipt, brittle and yellowed, from a tax auction, Carroll County Courthouse, dated the same week as Gordon's ledger entry, listing the winning bid, Ezra Sutter, $11 per acre, 10 acres, Sutter Ridge parcel. Clipped to it, in Ezra's own careful hand, a single line that made the whole shape of the last 50 years snap into focus. Cain bid 9, told him the road under this hill would find its way home to whoever had the patience to wait on it. He didn't believe me. Good. Caleb read it 3 times. Slow, the way he read everything important now. He set it down carefully on the kitchen table, the way he'd learned to handle every piece of paper that came through that shed lately, like each one might be the last thing his grandfather ever got to say to him. Then he called Nathaniel. A note like that, paired with a receipt like that, wasn't just family history anymore. It was motive. Laid out plain. Exactly why a Roanoke developer's grandson had shown up at his door so fast, with cash, before the state's appraisal went public. Exactly why Roy, scrambling to salvage a Myrtle Beach contract, had been so willing to let Beecham's thin theory drag things out. "This doesn't change your title," Nathaniel said carefully, once Caleb read him both documents. "The deed stands on its own regardless of motive. Its own. But it tells me something useful about your uncle's lawyer's strategy. If Beecham's petition is just cover for Cain, buying the corridor cheap before the state locks in title, our best move isn't fighting that petition inch by inch. It's getting you in front of everyone at once. On the record. Before Roy or Cain can maneuver you into a private settlement, neither once witnessed. How do we do that?" "There's a mediation conference already scheduled in 6 weeks," Nathaniel said. "Required before this can go to a formal hearing. Roy will be there. His lawyer will be there. If the state's appraisal comes back before then, Carol Meese's office will likely send a representative too. They need clear title before they can proceed." A pause. Caleb could hear a plan forming. "That's the room, Caleb, where you lay everything on the table at once. Deed and plat and note and receipt. In front of every party who's been circling this ridge, hoping you'd fold first. Not a courtroom drama. Just paper, read out loud, in the one room where it matters to everyone at once." Caleb thought about the will table, about Roy's laugh, about a folder sliding across that same kind of table 5 months earlier, when nobody in that room, including Caleb himself, had known what any of it was really worth. "Count the rows before you count the money," he said, mostly to himself. "What's that?" "Something my grandfather used to say," Caleb said. "I think I finally understand what he meant." The appraisal came back 4 weeks later, delivered by certified mail to the Faraday place. Caleb's landlord handed it over with real gravity, suspecting, correctly, that whatever was inside mattered more than the water heater he still hadn't fixed. Caleb sat on the porch steps and opened it. His hands had gotten steadier over the last 5 months. Steadier than he'd have believed possible back when $83 felt like the only fact in his life worth knowing. The state's certified appraisal valued the Sutter Ridge right-of-way corridor at $318,000. He read the number 4 times. He said it out loud once to the empty porch, to nobody. The same way he'd once said, "Count the rows before you count the money," to an empty cider shed. $318,000. For the dead trees Roy had laughed about at a will table. For the length of one bad joke. Caleb folded the appraisal letter carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep for the rest of your life. He drove out to the ridge that evening, climbed the back fence the way he'd been doing for months, stood beside the one living tree as the sun went down orange and low over Carroll County. "You knew," he said to the tree, or to the ridge, or to whoever was listening from wherever Ezra had gone. "You knew this whole time and you just waited." The tree didn't answer, the way trees don't. But the wind moved through it anyway. The same sound it had made every evening of Caleb's whole remembered life. For once that sound felt less like an ending, more like something patiently, finally beginning. Word travels fast in a county with one stoplight. By the following Sunday, half of Deacon's Mill seemed to know some number with a 3 in front of it had landed on the Sutter Ridge orchard. Even if nobody outside the courthouse had seen the actual figure, Caleb heard it secondhand from Wilkes, who heard it from a cousin at the county assessor's office. Roy had gone pale reading a copy of the same appraisal letter, forwarded to him by his own lawyer, a professional courtesy nobody in that office had legally required. Roy showed up at the Faraday place 2 days later without Denise. That told Caleb almost as much as anything he said, standing on the porch. $318,000, Roy said, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes for once. "That's what the state says it's worth. That's what the state says. That's more than the farmhouse is worth. More than the equipment. More than the whole rest of the estate combined. Roy's voice had lost its courtroom bluster. Gone thin. Almost young-sounding. The way a man sounds when a plan he'd built his whole future on has quietly started leaking air. The Myrtle Beach seller wants his deposit by the end of the month, or the contract's dead. I was counting on the equipment auction to cover it. Prices came in low. How low? 11,000 short. Roy looked out at the ridge, a dark line against the evening sky. I know how this looks, me showing up here after everything. But you're my brother's boy, Caleb. Whatever else, that's true. You called Ezra's deed a fairy tale, Caleb said. Not unkindly. Just flat. The way a man states a fact he's tired of carrying alone. You told a judge my grandfather wasn't in his right mind. You had a lawyer question whether I forged a signature from a document dated before I was born. I was scared, Roy said. I saw a number I didn't understand and I panicked. Panicking makes a man say things he wouldn't say, sober and calm. He turned back to Caleb. For the first time since the will reading, something in his face looked less like triumph, more like a man taking real stock of himself. I'm not asking you to hand me any of it. I know that ridge is yours, clean. I know I don't have a legal leg to stand on. My own lawyers told me as much in private, even if his petition still says otherwise on paper. I'm asking you to remember whose blood you share when this mediation happens. Maybe show a little more mercy than I showed you at that table. Caleb didn't answer right away. He thought about the water jug, and the note in the knothole, and the way Denise had said this isn't personal while helping strip his grandfather's tools out of a shed. Caleb wasn't even allowed to sleep in anymore. I'll think about it, he said finally. More than Roy had earned. Less than Roy was hoping for. Roy nodded once and drove away without pushing further. Caleb filed that away. Maybe the first genuinely honest thing his uncle had done since the funeral. Before any of that, though, there was the matter of Hollis Beecham's deposition request. A formal notice Nathaniel received by certified mail demanding Caleb sit for sworn questions about the deed's discovery. Timed, Nathaniel said flatly, to happen 2 days before mediation, and clearly designed to rattle him right when he needed to be steadiest. He can't force you to answer anything that isn't relevant, Nathaniel said, reading the notice over his kitchen table. But he can make you sit in a room for 3 hours, while he tries to trip you into saying something he can twist. I'll be there the whole time. Answer short, answer true. Never guess at something you don't know. The deposition happened in Beecham's own cramped Galax office, a court reporter typing steadily in the corner, Beecham himself leaning back in his chair with the studied casualness of a man who thought intimidation worked better slow than fast. Mr. Sutter, Beecham began, isn't it true you'd never seen this so-called deed before your grandfather's death? That's true. And isn't it convenient that it surfaced only after you inherited an otherwise worthless parcel? Objection, Nathaniel said, calm, argumentative. My client can answer if he wants to, but you're not entitled to a debate. Caleb answered anyway, steady, the way Gordon had coached him the night before over coffee. It wasn't convenient. It was hidden on purpose, by a man who knew exactly when somebody would need to find it. That's not the same thing. Beecham tried a dozen variations of the same question over the next 2 hours, circling, probing for a crack, and Caleb gave him nothing but short, true answers, the way Nathaniel had told him to, until even the court reporter seemed to lose interest in the repetition. By the time it ended, Beecham's frustration had leaked through his careful posture, and Nathaniel, walking Caleb out to the truck afterward, allowed himself a rare, small smile. He's got nothing, Nathaniel said. A deposition like that is supposed to find a weakness. All he found was a young man who tells the truth the same way 12 times in a row. He clapped Caleb once on the shoulder. That's worth more in front of a mediator than any speech I could give on your behalf. The Kane offer arrived one final time the following week, delivered in person this time, by a man who introduced himself, without any apparent shame, as Marcus Kane himself, Delbert's grandson. Lean, sharp-suited, 40s. He parked a car worth more than everything Caleb owned combined, on the gravel outside the Faraday place. 85,000, Marcus Kane said, laying a new offer sheet on the porch railing. Final number. Cash. Closes in 10 days. No contingencies. I understand you've had the state's appraisal by now. So let's not pretend you don't know what that number represents against 318,000. But the state's process is slow, Mr. Sutter. Eminent domain proceedings can take years, if contested. Given your uncle's pending litigation, a court could tie this whole corridor up in limbo, well past the point where the bypass project simply gets shelved again, the way it was in the 70s. My family remembers how that story ends. We'd rather guarantee you real money now than let you gamble on a highway that might never get built. Your grandfather told mine the same kind of thing, Caleb said, 50 years ago, at a tax auction. Something flickered across Marcus Kane's face. Quick, involuntary, gone before it fully formed. I don't know what you're referring to. I think you do, Caleb said. For the first time in this whole ordeal, something steady settled into his own voice, something that sounded, even to his own ears, uncomfortably close to the way Gordon talked, the way Ezra used to talk, patient, certain, entirely unhurried. My grandfather won this ridge fair, at auction, over your grandfather's bid, because he knew something about that highway corridor your family only ever guessed at. He waited 30 years for the truth to catch up. I think your family's been waiting just as long, for a chance to buy it back cheap, before anybody else remembered what it was really worth. Marcus Kane's easy smile had gone entirely rigid. That's an interesting piece of family folklore. I'd be careful repeating it without documentation. I have documentation, Caleb said. He watched, with a satisfaction he tried not to let show, the exact moment Marcus Kane's composure cracked at the edges. Just slightly, just enough, just. I'll leave the offer on the table through Friday, Kane said, gathering himself back into something smoother. Professional again, though his voice had lost its earlier ease. After that, we walk away. You can explain to whoever inherits your patient's next generation why a bird in hand was worth less than a highway that might sit in litigation for a decade. He left without waiting for a response. Caleb stood on the porch a long time after the expensive car's engine faded down the road, thinking about the receipt in Ezra's careful handwriting. The road under this hill would find its way home to whoever had the patience to wait on it. He understood that Ezra hadn't just been talking about himself when he wrote that line. He'd been talking about exactly this moment, 50 years in advance, trusting that whoever read it would still be standing when it finally arrived. 2 days after Kane's visit, Denise showed up at the Faraday place alone, without Roy, holding a casserole dish, like a peace offering nobody had asked for. I'm not here to fight, she said before Caleb could say anything. I wanted to say I'm sorry, for the inventory, for the shed, for all of it, honestly, though I know sorry doesn't undo a thing. She set the dish down on the porch railing, awkward, like she wasn't sure the gesture would land. Roy's not sleeping. He's proud and pride's about the only thing keeping him upright right now. But underneath it, he knows he's about to lose everything he tried to build by taking a shortcut instead of doing it slow, the way your grandfather did. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't think you're a cruel person, Caleb. Whatever Roy said at that table, Denise said. And I think whatever happens at that mediation, it'll matter to you afterward, whether you did it clean or whether you let this turn into something ugly just because you finally had the leverage to make it ugly. She turned to go, then stopped. Ezra never spoke ill of Roy to me, not once, not even after everything. Man had more patience than the rest of this family combined. I used to think that made him weak. I don't think that anymore. She left without waiting for a response, the casserole dish sitting on the railing, and Caleb carried it inside that night, though he didn't touch it for 2 more days, turning her words over the same slow way he turned over everything lately. Nathaniel, when Caleb described the visit that evening, didn't seem surprised so much as satisfied. The particular satisfaction of a lawyer watching an opposing party show his hand a little too early. That's useful, Nathaniel said. Kane showing up in person, referencing family history he claims not to recognize, pressuring you against your own documented appraisal, 3 days before mediation. If Beecham's petition really is just cover for Kane trying to buy the corridor cheap, we can raise that pattern at mediation. It won't win the case on its own, but it'll make clear to everyone in that room exactly what's been happening here. The night before the deposition, Gordon had sat with Caleb on the porch a long while, going over the kind of questions Beecham was likely to ask, coaching him the same patient way he must have once coached young survey hands fresh off the truck. Beecham's going to try to make you look rehearsed, Gordon said, like somebody fed you lines. Best defense against that is simple. Don't perform. Just tell the truth. plain the way you tell it to me on this porch, and let the truth do the work it's built to do. What if he asks something I don't have an answer for? Then you say you don't know, Gordon said. That's not weakness in a deposition, son. Making something up to sound smart, that's weakness. Saying I don't know, that's just honesty. And honesty holds up a lot longer under pressure than a clever answer does. He looked out at the dark ridge. Your grandfather never once tried to sound smarter than he was. Just steadier. That's the whole trick, if there is one. Caleb thought about that through the whole deposition the next day, every time Beecham circled back with a new angle on the same worn question. And it held, the way Gordon promised it would. Roy came by too, Caleb said. Asked me to show mercy. Nathaniel was quiet a moment. How do you feel about that? I don't know yet, Caleb admitted. He hurt me plenty. But he's drowning in a mess he built himself. Drowning men say things they don't mean, same as scared men file petitions they can't win. He looked out at the darkening yard. Ezra's note said, "Don't let Roy's laugh be louder than his own handwriting." I think that means don't let Roy's fear be louder than my own good sense either. Whatever I decide, I want it to be because it's right, not because I'm still angry at that table. That's a more generous instinct than most clients bring me, Nathaniel said. Sleep on it before mediation. You've got 3 days. Let's organise every piece of paper we have exactly the way you'll want to lay it out. They spent those 3 days at Nathaniel's kitchen table, the same table where he'd first read the deed. Going through everything, the certified deed. Gordon's plat and field notes, the note from the knothole, EIE, the tax auction receipt with Ezra's handwritten line about Delbert Kane, the state's appraisal letter, and a sworn affidavit Gordon agreed to provide, attesting, under penalty of perjury, to his first-hand knowledge of the 1969 survey and Ezra's sound mind at the time of purchase. This is more than enough to end Roy's petition outright, Nathaniel said, squaring the stack into a single folder. But mediation isn't really about winning a legal argument today, Caleb. It's about everyone in that room understanding, once and for all, exactly what happened. And exactly what's true. So nobody walks out still pretending otherwise. Caleb thought about the will table. 5 months ago now. Felt like a lifetime. Roy's laugh ringing off the walls of a room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet glue. A folder that had once felt like a punishment, sliding across the table toward him. He thought about carrying that same kind of folder into a different room, on a different day, setting it down himself this time, on his own terms, in his own time. That thought stayed with him the whole drive out to Wilkes's place that evening. Tool bag rattling in the truck bed, the ridge dark and quiet off to his right, the way it always was this time of day. Patient the way everything on it had learned. Over 50 years, to be. 2 days before mediation, Carol Meese called with news that shifted the ground under everything again. The Commonwealth Transportation Board had voted unanimously to move the bypass project to final design, a full stage earlier than anyone had projected, which meant the state's timeline for acquiring the corridor had just compressed from years to months. That's good for you, Carol said. Assuming the title question gets resolved at mediation, we can move to a purchase agreement almost immediately. That's also going to put more pressure on everyone else in that room to settle, rather than drag this out in court while the state's clock is ticking louder. Nathaniel took the news calmly when Caleb relayed it, turning it over the way he turned over every new fact, looking for the angle that helped and the angle that didn't. This cuts both ways, Nathaniel said. It strengthens our position, because a faster state timeline makes Roy's stall tactic look even more transparent, but it also raises the stakes in that room considerably. Everyone's going to know, or walking in, that whatever gets decided in mediation is going to move fast afterward. No more waiting around hoping something changes. He looked at Caleb steadily. Are you ready for that kind of speed? I've been ready since I found that floorboard, Caleb said. Everybody else is just catching up. The night before mediation, he drove out to Wilkes's place to return a set of fencing tools he'd borrowed weeks earlier. Wilkes met him at the gate, wiping grease off his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. Heard you got a big day tomorrow, Wilkes said. Word travels. Word always travels in this county. Half the time it's wrong. This time I hope it ain't. Wilkes studied him a moment. You scared? A little, Caleb admitted. Mostly I just want it done. Want to stop carrying it around. That's the right kind of scared, Wilkes said. The kind that still lets you sleep. He handed back a tool bag, then held onto the strap a second longer than he needed to. Your grandfather used to fence these lines with me, you know, before you were even thought of. Man never raised his voice once in 20 years of us arguing about post spacing. Didn't figure he raised his voice much anywhere. He didn't have to, Wilkes said. Some men are just built quiet and right. You're cut from the same cloth, Caleb, whether you believe it yet or not. He let go of the strap. Go get your paper read out loud tomorrow. Then come back and help me finish this back fence. Ridge work don't stop for lawyers. Caleb drove home in the dark with the tool bag on the seat beside him. He passed the turnoff to the ridge without stopping, the way he sometimes did lately, just to see the shape of the place from the road at night. Dark trees against a darker sky. The one living tree somewhere in the middle of it all. Patient as ever. Waiting on tomorrow the same as everything else on that hill always had. For the first time in 5 months, the knot in his chest loosened enough that he actually slept. That night, unable to sleep despite the calm Wilkes's visit had left in him, Caleb drove up to the ridge one last time before mediation, climbed the fence in the dark by feel alone, and stood by the one living tree with his hand flat against the bark the way he always did. Tomorrow, he said, quiet, to the tree, to the dark, to whoever was still listening. Tomorrow it gets said out loud, whatever happens after. The tree didn't answer. It never did. But the wind moved through it, the same steady way it always had, and Caleb walked back down to his truck feeling, for the first time since the will table, like a man walking towards something instead of away from it. Then let's go set the record straight, he said the next morning, standing on Nathaniel's porch with the folder under one arm. The mediation was held in a conference room at the Carroll County Courthouse Annex. Plain space, fluorescent lights. A long table that reminded Caleb, the moment he walked in, uncomfortably of the will, reading 5 months earlier. Roy sat on one side with Hollis Beecham beside him, a thin folder in front of them, considerably less substantial than the one Nathaniel carried. Marcus Kane sat further down, alone. He'd apparently decided his interest in the corridor entitled him to a seat, though he had no formal legal standing to attend. Nobody had yet asked him to leave. Carol Meese sat at the far end, representing the state. A court-appointed mediator named Ruth Aldous sat at the head of the table. The calm, weathered patience of a woman who'd spent 20 years watching families detonate over exactly this kind of inheritance. Caleb had barely slept the night before, running through Gordon's advice on a loop. Don't perform. Just tell the truth plain. And it was that same steadiness he reached for now, sitting in a chair that felt too hard and too close to the one he'd sat in at the will reading 5 months earlier. We're here, Ruth Aldous said, once everyone had settled, to see if this matter can be resolved without further litigation. Mr. Beecham, your petition challenges the validity of a 1969 deed. Mr. Cross, I understand you're prepared to respond. We are, Nathaniel said, and opened his folder. He laid it out the way he'd rehearsed 3 times over the last 3 days. Calm, unhurried, each document in the order that told the story cleanest. The certified 1969 deed, first. Ezra Sutter's signature, plain at the bottom. The original survey plat, Gordon's handwriting matching field notes he'd kept for 55 years. The tax auction receipt, $11 an acre. Ezra Sutter, winning bid, dated the same week as the plat. Carol Meese leaned forward slightly as each document landed, following along with the careful attention of a state employee who understood exactly how much rode on every date and every signature, holding up under scrutiny. Ruth Aldous made no notes yet, simply watched, the way a mediator watches a room to see which way the weight is actually shifting, before she says another word. My client's grandfather purchased this parcel at a lawful county tax auction in 1970, Nathaniel said. He recorded the right-of-way corridor the same year. He held clear, undisputed title for over 5 decades until his death this past spring. The petition alleges cognitive incompetency at the time of a will drafted this year. It says nothing, and can say nothing, about a man's competency in 1969, 35 years before his grandson was even born. Roy shifted in his seat, glancing once at Caleb, then away, and Caleb recognised the look, the same one Roy had worn walking away from the Faraday place 2 weeks earlier, a man watching his own strategy get smaller in real time. Beecham cleared his throat. The timing of the deed's recent discovery raises reasonable questions about Mr. Pruitt, Nathaniel said, cutting in gently but firmly. Gesturing toward Gordon at the back of the room, sworn affidavit in hand, was present at the original survey in 1969, and at the courthouse when Ezra Sutter recorded this exact deed. He's prepared to testify to that firsthand, under oath, today. Gordon read his affidavit aloud, a steady voice filling the small room. 30 years of county surveying credibility behind every word. Caleb watched Roy's face as Gordon spoke, watched the last of his uncle's legal posture deflate somewhere around the third sentence. "There's something else," Nathaniel said once Gordon finished. He slid the tax auction receipt forward, Ezra's handwritten note clipped to its corner. "This receipt shows another bidder at that 1970 auction, a man named Delbert Kane. He lost to Ezra Sutter's bid by $2 an acre." He looked deliberately down the table toward Marcus Kane, whose face had gone carefully blank. "My client's grandfather left a handwritten note explaining why he believed Mr. Kane wanted this parcel so badly. I'd like that noted for the record." A representative of the Kane family's development firm has made 3 separate cash offers to purchase this corridor in recent weeks. Each one below documented fair market value, and has attended today's proceeding despite having no formal legal standing in this matter. The room went very quiet. Marcus Kane's chair scraped back an inch, the small, involuntary sound of a man reconsidering his seating arrangement. "I was simply here as an interested party in the corridor's disposition," he said, too smoothly, too fast. "There's nothing improper about a business inquiry." "There's nothing improper about an inquiry," Ruth Aldous said. Mild but unmistakably pointed. "There may be something worth noting about the pattern of its timing, Mr. Kane, given what's now on this table." Caleb sat very still through all of it, hands folded on the table, the way Ezra used to sit at church. He let the paper do exactly what Nathaniel had promised it would do, speak for itself, in the one room where every interested party could hear it at the same time. "Mr. Sutter," Ruth Aldous said, turning finally to Roy, "your petition alleged forgery or improper influence over your father's estate planning. Do you still maintain that position, given what's been presented today?" Roy was quiet a long moment, looking at the deed, at Gordon's steady face, at the receipt with his own father's handwriting on it. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the courtroom bluster it carried at the will table 5 months earlier. "No," he said, "I don't." He looked at Caleb. For the first time since the funeral, something in his expression looked less like a man protecting a plan, more like a man facing the actual size of his own mistake. "I filed that petition scared, not because I believed it." "I'm sorry, Caleb. I should have said that a long time before this room." Beecham looked visibly uncomfortable at his own client, undercutting the petition in real time. He said nothing further. "Then I'd recommend," Ruth Aldous said, "that the petition be formally withdrawn. That clears the way for the state's acquisition to proceed on the existing appraisal. Assuming Mr. Sutter, the nephew, is prepared to negotiate final terms directly with Ms. Meese's office." Caleb looked at the folder in front of him. The deed, the plat, the receipt, the note he still hadn't shown anyone but Nathaniel. He felt the same steadiness that had carried him through Marcus Kane's porch visit settle into his chest one more time. "I'll negotiate in good faith," he said, "on one condition. The corridor gets built or it doesn't. That's the state's call, and I understand that. But if it does get built, I want the interchange access point routed so it serves both my orchard frontage and my uncle's remaining 40 acres equally. Not because he's entitled to it, because he's family, and because my grandfather spent 30 years being patient about a highway so that someday somebody in this family would come out ahead. I'd rather it be all of us than just me." Roy's head came up sharply at that, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. "You don't have to do that," he said, quiet. "I know," Caleb said. "I'm doing it anyway." Carol Meese made a note, said the access provision was reasonable, something she could incorporate into the formal acquisition agreement. Ruth Aldous, watching the whole exchange with the particular satisfaction of a mediator, seeing a room actually resolve something instead of merely surviving it, closed her folder and called the session to an early, unusually amicable end. Marcus Kane left first. Without another word, his expensive car pulling out of the annex parking lot faster than the speed limit strictly allowed. Roy lingered in the hallway afterward. Caleb, gathering Nathaniel's folder back together, found him standing near the annex exit, hands in his pockets, looking older than Caleb had ever seen him look. $318,000, Roy said, not quite meeting his eyes. For dead trees. They were never dead, Caleb said. Just waiting. Roy nodded slowly, like a man finally hearing a sentence said to him in a language he only now understood. Your grandfather was smarter than every one of us combined. I spent 30 years thinking he was just stubborn. He was both, Caleb said. Turns out that's not a contradiction. The Myrtle Beach deal fell through, Roy said. Lost the deposit. Denise is furious. A longer pause. I don't guess I've got any right asking you for anything after everything I said at that table. No, Caleb agreed. You don't. Roy flinched at that. Small. He started to turn away. Caleb, watching his uncle's shoulders drop, less like defeat and more like a man finally putting down a weight he'd carried badly for a long time, felt something shift in his own chest that surprised him. But I'm not my grandfather's whole lesson, Caleb said. And Roy turned back. He waited 30 years for a road to prove him right. I don't want to spend 30 years waiting for you to prove yourself wrong all over again. That access provision I asked for, it's real. Your 40 acres will front that interchange same as mine will. If you want to build something on it, something that actually lasts this time, instead of gambling the whole thing on somebody else's contract in Myrtle Beach, I'll help you figure out how. Roy stared at him a long moment, something working behind his eyes, almost like the boy he must have been once, before land and money and 30 years of quiet resentment hardened him into the man at that will table. Why would you do that? He said, after everything. Because Ezra didn't leave me a highway, Caleb said. He left me a reason to still believe people can come back from being wrong. Don't waste it. Roy didn't answer right away. He just nodded once, slow, and walked out to his truck alone in the annex parking lot, and Caleb watched him go without following. Because some things a man has to carry the first stretch of by himself before anybody else's hand on his shoulder means anything at all. The formal acquisition agreement took another 6 weeks to finalise. Nathaniel said that was fast for the government. Caleb spent most of that time doing two things: working Wilkes's fences for cash, walking the rows every morning, water jug in hand. Some habits didn't stop, not just because the reason behind them had finally come to light. Carol Meese's office confirmed the final price, $322,000, $4,000 above the original appraisal. The interchange access provision for Roy's 40 acres got folded into the final terms. The check arrived eventually. Cashiers. Certified. More zeros than Caleb had ever seen next to his own name. It felt almost unreal the day he deposited it. At the same bank branch where he'd once checked a balance of $83. Like a man checking a wound. He paid off the $41, in his own mind if nowhere official. The money he'd once spent certifying a deed that changed everything. He paid Patsy Dillard back too. 3 months of thermos coffee, repaid with a donation to the library's reading program. Large enough that she cried a little at the circulation desk. She told him Ezra would have been unbearably proud. Almost that exact phrase. Like pride itself might have been too much for a quiet man like Ezra to carry comfortably. He hired Gordon formally, on retainer. A consulting surveyor for what Caleb had started calling, half joking at first, the Sutter Ridge Corridor Project. Then not joking at all. An actual plan was taking shape. A small commercial pull-off, where the new interchange met the old orchard frontage. A place for truckers and travellers to stop. Buy gas, buy produce. Once somebody had the money to nurse the 10 acres back from 18 years of neglect. He kept the one living tree exactly where it stood. The interchange engineers asked, delicately, whether the whole 10 acres needed clearing for construction staging. Caleb said no. Not that tree. Redraw the plan around it if you have to. And they did. A man holding a $300,000 check has a certain amount of leverage, even over highway engineers. Caleb spent every bit of it on the one thing that actually mattered to him. Roy came by more than Caleb expected. Not often, but steadily. Small visits that felt less like reconciliation and more like slow, careful rebuilding. One honest conversation at a time. He brought his own equipment out one Saturday to help clear brush along the frontage line. Worked in silence beside Caleb for 3 hours. When he finally spoke, it was to ask quietly whether Caleb thought Ezra would have forgiven him. "I think he already did," Caleb said, "a long time before either of us figured out we needed forgiving. That's what the note in the tree was, really. Not just directions to a deed, permission to still believe in people. Even the ones who let you down. Even me? Especially you," Caleb said. "Otherwise, why leave you the 40 acres that'll front the interchange too?" Roy didn't answer that. Not in words. But he came back the next Saturday. And the one after that. Slowly over the months that followed, the two of them built something on that ridge. Neither one could have built it alone. A small stand at first. A roadside cooler of cold drinks, the sour, stubborn apples from the one living tree. Then, as the interchange progressed, something larger. A proper building, timber-framed. A sign out front, commissioned from a woodworker in Hillsville who'd known Ezra from the co-op meetings decades back. Denise never fully warmed to any of it. She kept a careful distance. Caleb decided, after some thought, not to take it personally. Some wounds a family carries longer than others. Pretending otherwise helps nobody. But she stopped making comments about the shed and the trees. Once, at a county fair the following autumn, Caleb caught her smiling at a jar of apple butter with the Sutter's label on it. Then she noticed him watching. She put it back on the shelf without buying it. That was fine. Not everything had to be fixed all at once. Some things, Ezra's whole life had taught him, just needed patience. Marcus Kane's development firm filed no further offers, no further visits. Nathaniel mentioned it almost in passing one afternoon. Word around the Roanoke real estate circles was that the Kane family had quietly dropped their interest in the corridor entirely. Once the mediation record became part of the public court file, unwilling apparently to have their grandfather's 50-year grudge attached publicly to their name in front of future business partners. "Some debts take longer than a lifetime to come due," Gordon said when Caleb told him. "Your grandfather never got to see Delbert Kane's grandson back down at that table. But I think he knew it would happen eventually. That's the whole art of patience, Caleb. You don't have to be there to win. You just have to build something that's still standing when the win finally arrives." Caleb thought about that a lot, that following spring. Watching the interchange take shape at the base of the ridge. Watching concrete pour where a dirt shoulder used to sit. Watching the state crews work unhurried, methodical. Men who had, in Caleb's private opinion, no idea they were completing a highway one stubborn man had bought and buried. 50 years he waited. The building went up that summer. Caleb named it Sutter's, plain the way Ezra would have wanted it. No embellishment. He hung one photograph inside the front door, an old black and white picture Patsy had dug out of a church directory archive. Ezra Sutter standing in the orchard rows sometime in the 1970s. Young. Lean. One hand resting on a sapling. Caleb understood now. Looking at that photograph every day, it had to be the very tree still fruiting sour and stubborn behind the building's back wall. He hired 2 people that first season. A high school kid named Travis who needed the work worse than most. An older woman named Franny who'd worked the register at the hardware store for 20 years before it closed. He paid them both a fair wage. It felt to Caleb less like generosity and more like plain fairness. The kind Ezra had practiced quietly his whole life, never once calling it charity. The stand did modest business that first summer, truckers mostly, a few tourists heading toward the parkway, locals curious enough to finally see what all the fuss on Sutter Ridge had amounted to. It wasn't going to make Caleb wealthy, not the way the settlement had. But that had never really been the point. Not for Ezra. Caleb was beginning to understand it wasn't really the point for himself either. He set aside a portion of every month's profit, small at first, into a fund he didn't tell anyone about right away. He called it, in his own private ledger, the Wilkes line, after the fencing money that had kept him fed those first hard weeks. When Travis's mother needed help covering a medical bill that fall, the money was already there, waiting, and Caleb handed it over the way Ezra used to hand things over, quietly. No speech attached, just a number and a nod. Patsy found out anyway, the way Patsy found out most things in that county, and she didn't say much about it either, beyond leaving an extra thermos on the reference desk the next time Caleb came in to research something new. Some kindnesses he was learning worked best passed along in the same silence they'd first arrived in, the The same way a note in a knothole says more by staying quiet than it ever could shouted from a rooftop. The point had been the ridge itself, still standing, still bearing fruit, still carrying a dead man's careful, patient handwriting, into a future he'd never lived to see. Roy stopped by one evening near the end of that first summer. Alone. No equipment this time. Just to sit on the front porch and watch traffic move along the new interchange below. Trucks and cars, using a road that had waited 50 years to exist. You ever think about selling this place? Roy asked, now that you've got the money to do whatever you want. Every day I think about it, Caleb admitted, for about 4 seconds. Then I remember what 4 seconds of thinking about money cost his whole family the first time around. I go back to pruning the tree instead. Roy laughed, short and real. The first genuine laugh Caleb had heard from him since long before the funeral. Ezra would have liked that answer. Ezra would have said it better, Caleb said, but I'm working on it. Autumn came back around Sutter Ridge, the way it always had, the one living tree loaded up with small sour apples. Caleb had grown to genuinely love the taste of them by then. The new interchange hummed steadily below the stand. Traffic counts already exceeded VDOT's original projections by a fair margin. Carol Meese mentioned it one afternoon. Quiet satisfaction of a state employee who liked being right about a corridor she'd fought to see built. He had started keeping his own ledger by then, a plain spiral notebook, $1.79 from the hardware store, tracking every dollar that moved through Sutter's, the way Ezra had tracked every acre and survey line for 50 patient years. Some months were thin. The interchange construction ran 18 months longer than the state's estimate. It ate into the settlement funds fast. $40,000 for the building, $12,000 for equipment, $6,000 for a well drilled deeper than anyone expected. But the ledger balanced month over month. It felt earned rather than lucky. That distinction mattered to Caleb more than he'd ever have predicted. Back when $83 was the only number in his life. Travis, the high school kid he'd hired that first summer, turned out to have a real gift for grafting. Gordon noticed it on one of his regular visits, spent an entire Saturday teaching him properly. By the second spring, the orchard had 11 new trees, started from cuttings off the one living survivor, a small, stubborn family of saplings. Caleb watered them every morning with the same dented jug, passing the habit forward the way Ezra had once passed it to him. You're building your own orchard now, Gordon told him, watching Travis work a graft. Careful learning hands, not the one your grandfather left you. A new one. That's a different kind of inheritance, Caleb. The kind you make instead of the kind you find. Caleb thought about that longer than he expected to. He'd spent so many months chasing what Ezra had already hidden, already built, already waited on, that it hadn't occurred to him he might someday be the one doing the hiding, the building, the waiting, for somebody not born yet. He watched Travis tie off a graft union with a steady hand and wondered, not for the first time, whether that was really what inheritance meant underneath all the deeds and appraisals. Not a thing handed down. A habit handed down instead, patient and quiet, from one set of hands to the next. You planning on staying in this county your whole life, Travis? Caleb asked, mostly to break his own train of thought. Don't see why not, Travis said, not looking up from the graft. Everything I care about's right here. Gordon caught Caleb's eye over the boy's bent head, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, that Ezra would have liked that answer better than almost anything else either of them could have told him. Franny at the register kept a small jar by the till, marked simply fuel. Regulars dropped spare change into it, for truckers who came up short on gas, a county away from home. A tradition Caleb hadn't started. He noticed it, though. He matched it, dollar for dollar, out of his own pocket every week, never announcing it. The same way Ezra had been generous his whole life, never once wanting credit for it. Roy's 40 acres slowly took shape as a small equipment rental yard, fronting the new interchange. A modest business, but a real one this time, built without a Myrtle Beach fantasy attached to it. Financed through a conventional loan once Roy's credit recovered from the collapsed real estate deal. Secured in part by the interchange access provision Caleb had insisted on at mediation. Denise ran the books for it, competent and quiet. She and Caleb never became close exactly, but she'd started nodding to him at the feed store instead of looking through him. In the slow arithmetic of a wounded family, that felt like real progress. The county recorder's office fielded 3 separate calls that year. Nathaniel mentioned it one afternoon over coffee. Other landowners along the old shelved corridor routes, people who'd heard the Sutter Ridge story secondhand, wanting their own family land records checked for forgotten right-of-way filings from the same era. None of the calls turned up anything. Not yet. But Nathaniel said he'd started keeping a small file on it anyway, just in case Ezra's kind of patience had been more common in that generation than anyone living gave it credit for. Caleb thought about that sometimes, behind the counter at Sutter's on a slow weekday afternoon, watching Travis graft another sapling, watching Franny make change for a trucker who'd stopped for gas and stayed for apple butter. He understood finally that the story had never really been about a highway, not underneath everything else. It had been about a man who refused to believe that being laughed at meant being wrong, who built, quietly, patiently, a legacy sturdy enough to outlast the joke entirely. He thought about the will table sometimes too, less often now, but on certain evenings, closing up the stand as the light went long and orange across the ridge, he could still hear Roy's laugh from that room. "Congratulations, kid, you got the dead trees." It didn't sting anymore, not the way it once had. It felt, if anything, like the first line of a story he was still writing every single day since. One honest transaction, one graft, $1 in Franny's jar at a time. Nathaniel closed out the last of the legal paperwork that winter. The mediation record, sealed into the county's permanent files. The acquisition agreement, fully executed. Roy's withdrawn petition, a quiet footnote in a docket nobody but a future title search would likely ever read again. Nathaniel came by the stand to deliver the final documents personally, stayed for coffee, told Caleb, almost as an afterthought on his way out, that he'd started telling the story to his own law students. A night class he taught in Withville, not by name, just as a case study in patience and documentation. "What's that?" Caleb asked. "That the law doesn't reward the loudest voice in the room," Nathaniel said. "It rewards whoever kept the best paper the longest. Your grandfather understood that 50 years before I ever passed the bar exam." Caleb walked the rows that evening after Nathaniel left, water jug in hand, out of pure habit now, past the 11 new saplings Travis had grafted, past the frontage, where Roy's rental yard lights had just flickered on, past the interchange itself, cars and trucks moving steady in both directions. A road that had waited 50 years underground for exactly this much ordinary, unremarkable traffic. He stopped the way he always did, at the one living tree, its branches heavier with fruit than they'd been in 18 years. Before Caleb ever laid a hand on it, he rested his palm flat against the bark, the way Ezra used to, the way Caleb had watched him do 1,000 mornings, without once understanding why it mattered. He understood now. "Count the rows before you count the money," he said quietly, to the tree, to the ridge, to whoever might still be listening. "I counted, Grandpa. It came out even in the end." Above him, the last of the evening light caught the new sign over Sutter's front porch. Ezra's name carried forward in plain block letters, over a road he'd bought and buried and waited a lifetime to see built. Caleb turned off the porch light behind him, locked the door, walked home in the dark, the way his grandfather always had, patient, unhurried, no longer alone. The second spring after the settlement, the state held a small ribbon-cutting ceremony. At the base of the interchange, the kind of modest county event that draws a few dozen people. A local news van from Roanoke. A table of lemonade Franny insisted on setting up, even though nobody had asked her to. Caleb hadn't expected to be asked to say anything. Mostly he wasn't, standing near the back in a clean shirt he'd bought for the occasion. Then the county supervisor called him up by name to stand beside the ribbon. The same man who'd once clapped Roy on the shoulder at the hardware store. The one who started this whole chain of gossip, rolling in the first place. "This corridor sat on a map for 51 years, the supervisor said, into a microphone that squealed once before settling. Because one man in this county had the patience to buy it, protect it, and wait for the rest of us to catch up. Ezra Sutter isn't here to see this road open. But his grandson is. I think that's about as fitting a tribute as this county's ever managed to put together." Caleb didn't have a speech prepared, hadn't wanted one, but standing there with the scissors in his hand, Roy just a few feet away in the crowd with Denise beside him, he found a handful of sentences anyway, plain ones, the kind Ezra himself might have used. My grandfather used to tell me to count the rules before I counted the money, he said. I didn't understand what he meant for a long time. I think I finally do. He wasn't talking about apples. He was talking about paying attention to what's actually in front of you. Slow and careful, instead of rushing past it toward whatever you think you're owed. He looked out at the small crowd. Patsy near the front, holding a thermos out of pure habit. Gordon, his dog's leashes looped twice around one hand. Nathaniel in a suit still slightly too formal for Deacon's Mill. This road took 51 years to get built. I don't think that was bad luck. I think it was exactly as long as it needed to take, for the right people to still be standing when it finally happened. He cut the ribbon to a scattering of applause, the local news camera clicking. Afterward, walking back up towards Sutter's with Gordon beside him, the old surveyor was quiet a long moment before he spoke. Your grandfather would have hated all that fuss, Gordon said, nodding back toward the ribbon and the news van packing up. But he'd have stood in the back and let it happen anyway. Same as you did. He understood something most people never quite learn. What's that? That dignity isn't about being loud when you're right, Gordon said. It's about being patient enough that being right eventually speaks for itself, without you having to raise your voice at all. He clapped Caleb once on the shoulder. An echo, though neither mentioned it, of the county supervisor's exact gesture back at the hardware store counter. You did that today. He'd have been unbearably proud, same as Patsy always says. Caleb thought about that, walking the rest of the way home, past the 11 grafted saplings, now tall enough to cast their own thin shadows, past Roy's rental yard, lights coming on steady against the evening, past the one living tree, standing exactly where it always had, patient and stubborn, and finally, after 18 years of being called dead, surrounded by an entire orchard of company. He still had the note from the knothole. He kept it now in a small frame behind the register at Sutter's, not for customers to read. Most of them never noticed it at all. For himself, a private thing. He glanced at most mornings while counting out the till. Ezra's handwriting, steady and sure across 4 decades of waiting. Don't let Roy's laugh be louder in your head than my handwriting. Count the rows, Caleb, then go count what they're worth. He had counted finally all the way through. The number that mattered most, he'd come to understand, had never really been $322,000. It had been the 11 new trees, the jar of spare change for strangers' gas tanks. Roy's laugh turning real again on a summer porch. A road built slow enough that everyone who deserved to see it, finished somehow, still had. The last thing Caleb did most evenings, closing up Sutter's, was walk out to the fence line, check the 3 survey markers Gordon had helped him find, and mark that first autumn. Iron pins driven into the ground back in 1969. 2 young surveyors in August heat. One of them his own grandfather. Patient even then. Decades before Caleb existed to inherit anything at all. He touched the nearest marker with 2 fingers, the way he'd once touched the bark of the one living tree, without knowing why it mattered. He turned toward home in the dark, unhurried, the ridge quiet behind him, the new road humming faint and steady below, carrying strangers safely home, the way Ezra had always meant it to. Some nights he still half expected to see his grandfather's truck parked crooked by the shed, headlights off, engine still ticking as it cooled. It never was. But the feeling came anyway, familiar now instead of painful, the way an old ache sometimes settles into something closer to company than grief. He didn't need a sign to tell him it was worth it. He already knew. A reporter from a small paper out of Withville called Sutter's that same week. She wanted a longer feature. What she called, over the phone, the highway that waited 50 years. Caleb agreed to the interview mostly because Patsy asked him to. Gently, over coffee, at the library table where this whole search had started for him months earlier. People in this county need stories like yours, Patsy said. Not because it makes good reading, though it does. Because half the families around here have some old deed or some old promise tucked away in a drawer somewhere. Most of them never think to look twice at it. Your story might be the reason somebody finally does. The reporter's name was Adele Fisk. She'd grown up 2 counties over, clearly did her homework before showing up. She spent an entire afternoon at Sutter's, talking first to Caleb behind the register, then to Gordon, out on his porch with the dogs settling around them both, then to Caleb's genuine surprise, to Roy at his rental yard. Roy spoke to her at length. With a candour Caleb hadn't quite expected, from a man who'd spent most of his adult life protecting his own version of events. He told me the whole thing, Adele said when she came back to Sutter's to confirm a few details. The will reading, the laugh, filing the petition. He didn't try to make himself look better than he was. That's new, Caleb admitted. He said something I wanted to check with you before I print it, Adele said, flipping through her notebook. He said, and I'm reading this exactly. I spent 30 years thinking my father's patience was just stubbornness. It took my nephew getting handed the one thing I laughed at to teach me the difference. I hope somebody prints that, so at least one other fool in this county learns it faster than I did. She looked up. Is that accurate as far as you know? That sounds exactly like something he'd finally say, Caleb said, about 2 years later than he should have, but exactly like him all the same. The article ran the following month, longer than Caleb expected, a photograph of him standing beside the one living tree, one cold, clear morning. For a week or two afterward, Sutter's saw more foot traffic than its entire first year combined, people driving out specifically to see the orchard that had hidden a highway, buying apple butter and cold drinks, asking Franny whether the story was really true. Every word Franny told them, every time. The particular satisfaction of a woman who genuinely loved being asked. Caleb didn't mind the attention exactly, though it sat strange on him at first. A young man who'd spent most of his life overlooked at family tables, suddenly fielding questions from strangers who'd read about him in a newspaper. What he minded less than expected was watching what the story did in the county once it spread. The way Nathaniel had predicted. Other families quietly pulling old deed boxes out of attics and tool sheds, checking dates against county records, wondering, some for the first time in decades, whether some forgotten patch of family land held a secret worth a second look. 2 of those calls, Nathaniel mentioned that autumn, turned up nothing but old farm equipment and disappointed hope. The more common outcome, he said, and worth being honest about. Not every attic holds a highway, but one call from a family named Ferris, 3 towns over, turned up an old mineral rights lease from the 1950s. A coal company had quietly let it lapse and forgotten it. Worth, once properly researched, a modest but genuinely useful settlement in. Enough to put a widowed grandmother's grandchildren through 2 years of community college apiece. That's the thing about patience, Gordon said when Caleb told him about the Ferris family. On the porch, over coffee, a ritual between them now. It's contagious if you let people see what it built instead of just what it cost to wait for. Your grandfather never saw that ripple. But I think he'd have liked knowing it happened. The Ferris grandmother came by Sutter's herself that winter, unannounced, just to shake Caleb's hand and tell him, in a voice that cracked halfway through, that her grandchildren would be the first in 3 generations to finish college without drowning in debt first. She didn't stay long. She bought a jar of apple butter she clearly didn't need, tucked a folded bill into Franny's fuel jar on her way out, and drove off before Caleb could think of anything worth saying back. He stood at the counter a long while after her car cleared the lot, turning that visit over the same way he'd once turned over Ezra's note in the knothole. Some debts, it turned out, paid themselves forward without anybody planning it that way. You just had to be patient enough to still be standing when they came due. Caleb thought about that a great deal that winter, the quietest season at Sutter's. Slow enough that he spent most short afternoons doing the books. Same kitchen table where Nathaniel had first read his grandfather's deed. The fire going, snow settling thin, and even across the ridge outside the window. The 11 grafted saplings dormant now, waiting, the way everything on this ridge eventually learned to wait. He kept Ezra's spiral ledger going all winter, the way he had every month since the settlement. On the last page of the year, in his own handwriting now, he wrote a single line. It felt less like an ending and more like a promise carried forward. The kind Ezra had once tucked into a knothole for a grandson not yet born. Count the rows before you count the money. It came out even, and it will keep coming out even, as long as somebody's still willing to wait on it. He closed the ledger, banked the fire low for the night, looked out one last time at the ridge. Dark now, snow catching faint moonlight along rows that had waited 51 years to matter to anyone. Just a patient old man, and eventually the grandson who finally understood him. Spring would bring the 11th anniversary of the corridor's original approval, the interchange's second full year of steady traffic. And Caleb suspected, without knowing quite how yet, some new small thing worth waiting patiently for. It always did, on this ridge. It always would. Spring did come, the way it always had on Sutter Ridge. The interchange's second full year of traffic kept climbing past whatever number the state had projected. A new sign went up on the stand's side wall, smaller than the main one out front. It listed the names of everyone who'd helped get Sutters built. Gordon, Nathaniel, Patsy, Franny, Travis, even Roy, whose name Caleb insisted on including. Over Roy's own quiet protest that he hadn't done enough to earn it. "You showed up," Caleb told him, the day he unveiled it. "Some Saturdays, that's the whole job." Ezra used to say the same thing about the survey crew. Half of getting anything built was just men willing to keep showing up in bad weather. Until the thing existed. Roy studied the sign a long moment. His own name plain among the others, he didn't say much. But Caleb noticed the following week that Roy had started bringing his own thermos out to the ridge on Saturday mornings. Unprompted. The same habit Ezra had carried and passed down, without ever explaining why it mattered, until it simply did. Denise rode along with him now, more often than not. She rarely stayed long, but she'd started bringing a covered dish for whoever was working that morning. Nobody in the family mentioned it out loud. Some kindnesses land softer when nobody names them. The 11 grafted saplings came into their first real fruit that summer. Small and green. Not yet sour, the particular way the old tree's apples were. Travis, nearly finished with a horticulture program Caleb had quietly helped him afford, pronounced them promising. From Travis, who rarely praised anything without reservation, that counted as something close to triumph. He'd started keeping his own notebook that spring too, tracking bloom dates, graft survival rates, the same careful way Caleb tracked dollars in his spiral ledger. Caleb caught himself smiling at that more than once. How naturally the habit of patient record-keeping seemed to travel from one generation to the next. Nobody ever sat down to formally teach it. Gordon came by less often that year, his knees finally slowing him down the way he'd joked they eventually would. But he still made the drive out most Sundays, dogs riding along in the truck bed, to sit on Sutter's porch and watch the traffic below with the satisfaction of a man who'd helped build something that outlasted his own working years. Caleb kept a chair on the porch, reserved for him, without ever saying so out loud, and Gordon, without ever saying so either, always knew exactly which one it was. Denise finally bought a jar of the apple butter that autumn, same county fair table, where she'd once put one back on the shelf. She didn't say much about it, just a short nod in Caleb's direction. Roy told him later, laughing, that she'd finished the whole jar herself inside of a week. Denied it completely when he teased her about it. Adele Fisk's article got picked up by a larger paper out of Roanoke. Then, briefly, a regional television segment about overlooked family land and forgotten easements. For a season or two, Sutter's became something of a modest local landmark. A stop on the drive for people curious about the highway that waited 50 years. The attention thinned out naturally, the way most attention does. What remained was simply the stand itself. Steady. Ordinary. Doing exactly what it had been built to do. Caleb never did sell the corridor's remaining commercial rights. 2 more inquiries came over the following years. One from a chain gas station company, one from a different developer entirely, unrelated to the Kane family, who'd read about the interchange's traffic numbers and smelled opportunity the way developers always seem to. Both offers, when Nathaniel reviewed them, came in comfortably above 6 figures. Real money by any measure Caleb had once used to size up his own life. Both times he said no within a week. The number had simply stopped being the point. Somewhere between the mediation room and the first spring, the 11 saplings bore fruit. The ridge had stopped being an investment in his mind. It had become, simply and completely, home. In every sense his grandfather had ever meant the word. He still walked the rows every morning, water jug in hand, past 11 young trees now, past the interchange humming steady below, past the 3 survey markers Gordon had helped him find and mark, out to the one living tree that had started this whole reckoning, the tree that outlasted 18 years of neglect, a will table's cruel laugh, a cousin developer's grudge, 50 years deep, a family nearly torn apart, trying to claim what a patient dead man had quietly protected all along. He rested his palm against the bark one more time, the way he did every single morning now, out of habit and out of love in equal measure. He looked down the ridge at the road his grandfather had waited a lifetime to see finished. Cars and trucks move steady in both directions below. Ordinary. Unhurried. Exactly the way a road is supposed to move, once it finally, patiently, gets to exist. Franny's truck pulled into the lot behind him, gravel crunching under her tyres, the same way it always did. Down at the register, Travis was already unstacking chairs for the morning rush. The whole quiet machine of the place Ezra had waited 51 years to see built simply kept turning. One ordinary day at a time, the tree held steady under his hand. He walked back toward the stand to open for the day.